tweet, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that was the one. I found it super interesting. Super interesting. Cool. I'll introduce you quickly as Matt in Tokyo, yeah? Is that your underscore and everything?
Yeah.
Epic. Brilliant. Well, welcome back, guys. Thank you very much for being here. I've got an absolute cracking guest for you today. I'm going to be talking to him about life in Japan, the culture, the language. It's Matt in Tokyo. You can find him at Matt underscore in underscore Tokyo on Twitter and on any other social medias. Matt, are you on Instagram or?
Well, I'm gonna be starting YouTube hopefully later this month, but not yet. And I am on Insta as well, but that's also mostly not yet. So mostly just X right now. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, so it's called X now. Yeah, you're right. You should correct me.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
I've been on it for a while since the days of the Twitter. But yeah, that's right, on X. Epic, man. And it was on X I found you and like had to DM you because I was like,
Yeah.
man, super interesting. And I'd like to just chat to you a little bit about that today, if that's all right with you. About how the language and the culture, there's really like no separation. They are like so intertwined. And I
Yeah.
wondered about Japan. Was it you put a message under my tweet, wasn't it? Because was wondering about Japanese culture and how they seem
Yeah.
so like polite and humble. And I was like, there must be a link in the language. And then you put a tweet underneath that. Could you just talk about that tweet that you wrote?
Sure. I don't remember exactly what I wrote, but I think you were asking about I think you had the impression that because Japanese society it has this image of being very polite and respectful, that you bet that it is reflected somehow in the language, right? And so my tweet, I think, was just a reply to that to say, yes, it is reflected in the language, because in Japanese we have uh, it's kind of rigidly split into different layers of politeness. And so if you're speaking very casually, then you're using like the base uh, I don't know, like a base layer of the grammar, which is like the same form that you'll find for words in the dictionary. So when you're using casual speech, you're speaking the same way that you'll find words in the dictionary. But as you increase in layers of politeness, there are certain conjugations that you can do, which will signify that you're treating the other person, the listener, you're treating them more respectfully. So um, I can dive into that a little bit if you want. It's uh, there is the first level up, I guess you would say, is something called teinego, and teine just means polite. And so that's when you add des and mas onto the ends of your sentences and verbs. And that just immediately signifies that you're being a bit more polite. So if you go into a shop or something, they'll always use des and mas. Or if you're in the office, you'll always add des and mas onto pretty much whatever you're saying. But then even higher, even beyond that, uh, there's something called keigo. Well, actually, teinego is a kind of keigo, but it's like the weakest version. So when people talk about keigo, they're usually talking about these two specific types of keigo, which is song keigo and kenjogo, which is what they're called. And one is humble speech, and one is honorific speech. So the humble speech, when you're talking to someone, you're actually changing not just the verb conjugations, but you're completely switching out the words that you use. And so you might use a completely different version of the verb or a word that is that has a very humble connotation. So it basically it kind of it lowers you in respect to the speaker. So so it kind of implies that the other person is more important than you, or that uh, you know, you're being humble. That's why it's called humble speech. And then honorific is basically the opposite, where you're raising the other person up. So you switch out the words, and um, and then it also implies the other person, the listener, is more important than you. So that's a basic uh, introduction to Japanese politeness levels. But yeah, so it definitely is baked into the language, and it's quite an interesting aspect, but also a very tricky aspect, because you can't just learn one verb and just be done with it. You have to you have to continually learn all these different ways of speaking, and that can be difficult. Yeah.
Mm. How would you interact then with like an elderly person? Is it done by age or just like with regarding like professions? Like obviously, if you walk into a shop, I'm guessing you're both gonna speak on
Mm.
a formal level, right? But then if like you're in the street and talking to like an elderly person, they
Yeah.
might they use like a um I can't remember how you called it now, but the one that they like
Kale, yeah.
would they humble themselves or would they make you humble in a way, or
No,
do they speak to you informally?
so in the modern day, I think most people they're gonna talk with the teenage, or that basic level of politeness with the des and mas,
Okay.
regardless of who is technically superior in that situation. In the past, I get the impression that in the past, if there was someone who is clearly your senior, then maybe they aren't going to speak to you politely. Maybe they'll speak to you in casual language, and then you would speak to them politely. But now I think most people, we have this kind of attitude of, everyone is equal kind of thing. I think that way of thinking is becoming more prevalent, and so um, I would expect that everyone would speak to each other politely, but not necessarily using actual, the humble speech and the honorific speech, because um, that actually creates like quite a strong sense of distance between you both, because that's very it's like it's a bit too polite, it's deferential. So it's not like you're equal anymore. It's like, okay, you are definitely my superior kind of thing. So on
And
the street, yeah.
sorry, yeah, when would you find an example of that then? Like when someone's working like in a bank or something and you're just there.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're working in a bank and, it's like your boss or your boss's boss or something like that, then you would absolutely use these higher levels of keigo, I think. Yeah.
Mm-mm. Which would make sense in a working environment, right? But I can imagine it must be quite
Yeah.
tricky. And I don't know if you've experienced this with any of your like colleagues. Like in the workplace, you can speak to each other on that level because it makes sense. They're above you, you're down here. But then if you ever to like go out with them and socialize, is there much of that kind of culture then in Japan? Or is it very much you work with these people, you don't see them outside of work? Do you know, like in the UK, especially in places like London, it's very common for like a person to have a drink with someone in a bar or a pub after work, and
Yeah.
kind of the formalities are kind of they're there at work, but it's kind of a professional show. And then after you're all talking about getting drunk and whatnot. Do you have that
Yeah.
culture in Japan or not? Are they very separate,
Um,
social life and work life?
it's difficult to answer because it kind of goes both ways, I think. So in Japan, we have a very strong culture of nomikai. And nomikai is like a drinking party that colleagues will get together and they'll go out drinking. And it's such a strong culture that it's kind of part of your job a lot of the time to participate in these nomikais, and it might be difficult for you to refuse. But it's also kind of weird in a way, because like if you go to one of these nomikais and you get drunk together, then it's kind of like, what happens on the nomikai stays on the nomikai. You can get away with breaking some of these rules where usually you can't. So even if you were to get drunk and complain about your job or something like that, it's very easy for people to just, brush it off and ignore it because, so and so was drunk on the nomikai, so there is that aspect. And yeah, I think if people at the workplace they become close, then they might go out drinking with each other. But Japan also has more so than the West, I think. It has yeah, this kind of uh it's difficult for you to break that barrier and make a real personal connection with someone at work, I think, because in Japan, you don't want to overshare about, what's going on in your personal life, etc., because it can be a bit of a burden on the other person. And so in the workplace or Japanese society, people want to preserve the harmony, so to speak. And so I think that creates a bit of a barrier for people to become actual friends enough to just normally hang out outside of work. But it's not that it doesn't happen. It depends on the people involved, I think.
Mm. And I'm wondering, like, how have you found that? Obviously, I guess you grew up in the UK and have lived in. How long have you been living in Japan?
8 years.
8 years. Okay, you've been there a while then. Like, how was that initial
Yeah.
culture shock in the workplace? Because I've heard some things as
Mm.
well about Japanese people, and well, I don't want to get too dark on this on my YouTube channel, but people like committing suicide and things like that,
Oh yeah.
from how they work and because it's so intense and whatnot. Do
Yeah.
you mind talking about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're talking about is something called karoshi, which is death from overwork, literally. So
I got a word for it.
um,
Oh my God.
yeah,
Wow.
and yeah, and I mean it's not like literally you're at your desk and you die from overwork, but I mean, okay, maybe that's happened. I'm not sure, but it can also be like you can't take the stress, and so you want to finish things, that kind of a thing. So it's a very dark topic, and it happens because in Japan there's this concept of a black company. We call it black kigyo, and what that is a company that doesn't actually um, stick to the law. So the law says, on your contract, you can only ask someone to work 40 hours a week, etc. There are various limitations to what you're allowed to ask from employees. But black companies, they basically ignore those and they use various tactics like social pressure, etc., to kind of to basically make you feel forced that you have to do these things that aren't in your contract. These like you're kind of overburdened with your obligation to the company, and if that continues for a long time, then yeah, it can make you depressed and feel trapped, etc. I I think that's what's going on with the karoshi.
Man, that is so different to how things operate in the UK, where you could argue that workers
Yeah,
have a lot of rights. Like it
yeah,
makes it a
yeah,
bit difficult for the employer at times. I feel certainly for small businesses operating in the UK, like the workers have so much power, and it's the complete flip opposite of that. And I hesitate to talk about this just because I'm in the country at the moment, but in Italy it's not dissimilar in how you can have a contract and they might say, okay, you're going to work 40 hours and you sign that contract and then you get to the job and you're there working 48 hours, and you speak to your colleagues and you're like, well, what is this? It's in the contract that we're supposed to do 40. And they're like, yeah, it's just how things are, You're kind of expected to, how can I put this in a polite way, get shafted. It's just an
yeah,
expectation of the culture of just, yeah, that's what it's like. There are not many jobs here in Italy. So if you want a job, then so the employer has all the
yeah.
power. Man, I can imagine. Did that take some like adjusting to? Not to say you work in one of those so-called black companies,
Um,
but
yeah. Well, it's a problem. Even if you don't work for one of these black companies, Japan, it doesn't have a good reputation for working culture. Even if you're working for a normal company that is doing things above board, then there is still often the felt sense of obligation to work a lot of overtime and give a lot to the company. Um, so I kind of knew about that when I was, when I was deciding to come to Japan. I thought this is one of the prices that I'm probably going to have to pay in order to go to Japan and make a living there. But I have been quite lucky. I mean, my first 2 years in Japan, I just went to a language school, so I wasn't actually working. And then after that, I got a job and I worked at that company. And I'd say it was a gray company, so it's kind of in the middle. It wasn't quite black, but it's a bit gray. I remember they did this. They used to send around this PowerPoint presentation file every Tuesday morning or something, and it would have like a bar graph. Like it would be like a bar chart where everyone has their own bar, and there's like this level, there's a line, and it counts up how many hours you were in the office last week. And this line is actually more hours than a full-time job. It was more than 40 hours a week. So it's like, I don't know, 45 or more hours. And so it would compare everyone and publicly show everyone how many hours they were working. And it was basically an exercise in pressuring you to do more hours. I mean, for me, I just ignored it, and I didn't yeah, I didn't really care about that kind of thing. I just ignored it and did my standard hours as much as I could. But that's an example. That's my own experience of this kind of a situation where they really try to pressure you to work a bit more. Yeah.
Mm, mm. Yeah, so you didn't, because of the cultural differences, right? You coming from the UK, you didn't kind of cave into that social pressure. You were like, oh, that's a nice bar graph kind of thing. Good for you.
Yeah, yeah. And also in that job, I was on a different contract. I was a like a temporary worker. So I wasn't a seishain, which is like a full-time employee of the company itself. I was just a contracted worker. So I figured it doesn't apply to me, even though I'm on the bar chart. I figured it doesn't apply to me, but of course, they wanted me to work as much as possible, I'm sure, but nobody said anything explicitly. I think that's another thing with Japanese culture. It's they use all this kind of soft power, you know. They don't explicitly tell you have to do this, you have to do whatever. There's nothing on the record, right? I guess that covers their basis in terms of liability and stuff as well. But yeah, so it's all just ambient pressure, I guess you could call it.
That is fascinating, man. That's so, so
Yeah.
interesting. Kind of like, yeah, you get that social pressure, so you feel like I have to do this, I have to conform.
Yeah.
Would you kind of get looks from other people? Like in that, how does that social pressure kind of work? Or were you just completely like, ah, whatever? Or are people going to make sly remarks like, oh, look at his score. He's a, I don't know. They've probably got a word for someone who doesn't work very hard, right? I can imagine they've got a lot of, is that right or not?
Well, I don't know, maybe some slang words, I'm not sure, but I mean, for me, like my experience is of a foreigner living in Japan. And um so Japanese culture, it has this kind of it's kind of like there's a bright line. So there's Japanese people and then there's foreign people. And if you're Japanese, then you have to play by the Japanese rules and Japanese societal expectations of you, etc., because you're part of the Japanese crowd. But as a foreigner, it's there is actually a phrase called gaijin pass, which is where sorry, actually, gaijin smash. In fact, gaijin smash, where because you're a foreigner, a gaijin, right? You can kind of smash your way through these rules like they don't apply to you, and people will give you a pass. They'll give you a free pass because you're a foreigner. You know, you're not expected to live up to the same expectations as Japanese people. So if you are a foreigner and you come to Japan, I do recommend that you use that to your advantage where appropriate. So for things like not doing overtime, you know, people might say, hey, you know, Matt isn't doing the overtime, but hey, he's a foreigner, you know, it doesn't apply to him, kind of thing. That's kind of how they might think. Not necessarily in all cases, but you can get away with a lot just by being a foreigner. Yeah.
Yeah, how have you found? integrating into the culture? Is it possible to integrate? Because obviously we look
Mm.
different, right? People from different races. I remember being in Senegal. I spent 3 months there, and I was like, it doesn't matter how much Wolof, which is their native, most widely spoken dialect, right? It doesn't matter how much Wolof I learn, how many like their dances or whatever I learn. I didn't feel I could ever fully integrate because I'll always be Tubab is what they call white people in there. Do you know? I'll always have kids running up to me on the street saying Tubab, give me money and things like this. Like it's just part of the culture. I can't imagine Japanese people go that far. But how have you found like sticking out so much, like physically? Has it been difficult on that
Mm.
level, or are there a lot of foreigners? Because you're in Tokyo, right? I imagine it's quite a
Yeah.
cosmopolitan place.
Yeah. In Tokyo, I've never felt explicitly as if I'm an outsider or anything. In Tokyo, people don't stare at you. You don't feel particularly uh, like special in a way. If you hear people's stories of going out into the countryside, places where there aren't very many foreigners, then maybe people will even come up to you and just, start conversations to practice their English. Maybe people are gonna stare at you on the train, etc., because you might be the first foreigner that they've seen like all year or something, or like, what's he doing here, But in Tokyo, there's plenty of foreigners, so you don't stand out. It doesn't feel unusual. But on the subject of integrating into society, as a foreigner, you're never going to be Japanese. You're never going to be treated as Japanese, even if your Japanese is perfect. Even if you get a Japanese passport and you become a citizen of Japan, okay, people might treat you Japanese in terms of like the rules and so on, but I don't know, somewhere deep in their head, I don't think that you're ever going to be fully Japanese in their eyes. It's a different culture to say America, I think, where anyone can become an American, I think.
Yeah, very, very different. Very different. And the UK as well, where we've got such a mixture of like
Yeah.
cultures and races and whatnot. Someone says to me, I'm from the UK, I kind of go off of their accent more than anything. If they sound like they're from the UK, I'm like, yeah, yeah, you're definitely from England. Here in Italy, and that's why, I mean, I want to talk to you about like racism and stuff, if you've experienced that on any level. Maybe not in Tokyo, but definitely here in Italy, because the people who are here, that even though their parents they might be second generation like Italian, if they've got like dark skin or if they clearly look like they're from a different country, the Italians don't accept them, especially here where I'm on Sardinia, it's an island, right? So it's even more like that island mentality. I know myself, like I'm never going to be Sardo. As much as I can learn the dialect and my Italian's good and whatnot, I know that because I look like a foreigner, I'm always going to be a foreigner. Have you
Mm.
experienced any of like the negatives of being clearly not Japanese?
And not really. I mean, there are very small things. So, like, if I'm on the train, then oftentimes, people don't want to sit next to me on the train until like there's only one seat left, and then they'll be like, okay, I guess I'll sit next to the foreigner. I don't know what that is about, to be honest, because it seems to just be such a widespread phenomenon, and they don't seem to add up. Like, some people say, oh, maybe they're scared the foreigner's gonna talk in English to them or something. But to me, it doesn't really add up because maybe you're wearing massive headphones or something. Um, Apart from very minor things like that, not really. I think as a as a foreign resident, sometimes the government does treat you as a second class citizen. So um, almost all the time it doesn't really make a difference, but there was during COVID, there was a period of about 6 months, I think, where if you were a foreign resident of Japan, but you were outside Japan, Japan wouldn't let you back into the country, even though that's your home, that's where you live. I mean, I stayed in Japan the whole time, so it didn't affect me. But just seeing the government treat residents of its country that way, um, yeah, that wasn't that was a little bit shocking to me, to be honest.
Mm.
And if you were a Japanese citizen, then you could come back into the country.
Mm.
So very occasionally there might be something like that might negatively affect you, but for the most part, there's not really too much that you have to worry about, in my opinion.
Yeah. And my final question I've got is about integration in the language. The fact that you
Mm.
speak Japanese, how much do you think has that helped you being able to actually speak Japanese and communicate with people? Because you must have met in Tokyo people who don't speak Japanese or maybe know a couple of words. What has been like the major difference for you being able to speak
Mm.
to locals?
It's it's not something that you can measure. I think it just massively changes the number of opportunities that you have in the country if you can speak the language. So just from my personal life, I know that this current job that I have right now, so at the moment I'm working for a tech company, but it's very international. But it's still a Japanese company, and we have Japanese clients. And so my ability to speak Japanese in the meetings with Japanese clients, etc. That's probably one of the reasons I got this job in the first place. I could do the interview in Japanese. And another example would just be I've had at least one relationship in Japan where it's been our shared language is Japanese. I was dating a Korean girl for a while, and so Japanese was her second language, and Japanese is my second language. I don't speak Korean. She didn't speak English. But that relationship is only possible because we both speak Japanese. And the same, usually, if you're going to date a Japanese girl, you're going to have so many more options if you can speak Japanese. Even if they speak some English, it might not be enough to actually have a deep relationship without communication difficulties. Uh, because that's another thing. It's not just the language itself; it's also understanding, these cultural differences about how people think and so on. And it's kind of part and parcel with the language itself, I think. But having Japanese, it just opens so many doors for you, in my opinion. I couldn't imagine not learning it and living here as long as I have. You kind of have to just live in a bubble if that's what you're gonna do. And yeah, I highly recommend people uh, just expand the horizons of their comfort zone and just get out there and experience everything that they can.
Epic, man. Thank you so much. This has been such fun chatting and super insightful for me. Annoyingly, I'm kind of feeling like, oh, do I want to learn Japanese now? Just another thing. I'm going to try not to dabble in that language. But you've inspired me, man. Thank you so much for joining me today. And yeah, I hope to chat to you in the future.
Thank you. The pleasure's been all mine. Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed this.
Thanks a lot.